saw a reel of you where you were talking about how there's no subconscious. Basically, want to ask about like expand that topic.
Yeah, I guess what I meant by that was more challenging, like Freud or Carl Jung's conception of the unconscious or subconscious, because obviously there's subconscious slash preconscious faculties. Like right now, I'm not really thinking about my words that much; they're just happening. So obviously, there's some semblance of unconsciousness. But I think this modern conception, psychological conception, is very wrong in how it treats that. So it treats it almost as like this magical mental space and where you can like draw insights from it, or sometimes they use that to like diagnose you with certain mental illnesses. They try to like psychoanalyze you. And I just find a real problem with that because you have one brain. You really consciousness has a surface and then it has what's underneath the surface. But to me, it's one pool, it's one ocean, basically. I
Yeah,
guess the
it's
point
one.
where sorry, I was just gonna say the point where it gets reflected is what you see, right? Because it's the surface, it's reflecting the world. But that doesn't mean what's underneath isn't still like within your control, basically.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent, I agree with you. I think the issue arises when there's so much like imagery and narrative around the unconscious, whether that goes from like the classic ones I was taught in school about seeing the mind like an iceberg, and that there's this very small tip that's the conscious mind above the surface of the water, but so much of what's really going on is underneath the water, or it's Jung's sort of imagery about these collective unconscious, where we imagine we've all got this kind of like underground psyche that knows things that we don't currently know, and there's always kind of playful, a very abstract imagery going on. And I think the problem arises when we take that imagery literally. Like what these great thinkers have had to do is use these kind of metaphors to make us try and understand something that we can't truly grasp because it is unconscious. But obviously there's truth to it, in that there are so much things, even just as simple as biological processes that are going on completely out of our control. And then you could maybe elaborate that to, yes, there will be psychological processes going on that aren't under our control, like the ways that we feel in social situations when we're hit with anxiety or something. It's not like a choice that we make, but that's to do with how we're being perceived in that social hierarchy, and depending on our competence and how we know people and all that kind of stuff. So there is things going on, but I think when we go into those, Freudian, Jungian imagery, which I do love and I find really fascinating, if we take that as being objective, that there's like this dark little dungeon in our own brain, then I think we're moving away from how things actually are. But that we have to see those as that's a metaphor to help us understand. It's not necessarily like the way it is.
So,
Yeah.
what would you kind of like attribute maybe the thoughts that we're not aware we're doing, or sorry, yeah, the actions that we're not aware we're doing? What would you kind of attribute that to?
Me? I guess time, like how time works. So there's like one immanence for everything, but like our brain is an object and so is brain chemistry. So you can't really think about multiple things at once. So things like anxiety, I think, are past thoughts or even future thoughts kind of like arising when they're not supposed to, or arising when you didn't, want them to, because or interrupting, let's say, your present mode of being. So that's basically what I would attribute it to, is kind of your past self interrupting your current self.
I mean, I can see the point in there, because conscious you only has a certain bandwidth of like information that you can deal with and that you can process at one time, whereas past you has been through a lot and learned a lot. And then what the mind does is we rely a lot then on things that we've learned from the past, sort of ideas around what is expected of us in situations, or how we should feel, or how that person is likely to feel. And then the thoughts that seem to emerge automatically are just informed by our past experience. And then the thoughts that emerge automatically in anxiety, like you say, could be our anticipation of what might happen, what future situation we're going to be in. It's interesting. I never thought about it that way. Like the you now only has a certain bandwidth, but you before, and where you might be, which is informed by you before, that's like you use that subconscious is just like a big pool of information that you had from the past that you use then to manage the present moment, and thoughts are kind of just a communicator of that. Yeah.
And if there's bits of, I don't know if this is the same thing. Remind me, Joel, who I think it's Young, isn't it? Who has kind of like the diagram of the shadow and the ego, and bits of that. Would that kind of go under the same thing of, well, there's not necessarily parts of yourself; it's just one self, and these are different. These are just maybe fluctuations between states of being.
Yeah. I mean, his idea was that the self was this kind of big, quite unfathomable pool of all the potential versions of you that you could be, including all that stuff about your past and your shadow, and your ego is this very small kind of island on top of that pool, which is the conscious you that isn't aware of the self. But maybe what we're talking about here is questioning, well, are you also the parts of yourself that you don't understand? Maybe that's true, because it's still part of you. It's just like you haven't really got your head around it yet, and maybe you never will. But maybe we can't just identify with ego in this moment, because that doesn't really do us justice. There's so much depth and complexity to being a human being, and maybe we need to take ownership of that and not label it as like an unconscious that we can't control, but label it as that's just me, the parts of me I don't yet understand yet, and that's an exciting thing.